The chandeliers of the Duke of Hartwell's ballroom cast 1,000 points of light across the polished parquet floor, transforming the assembly into a glittering tableau of silk and ambition. Eleanor Hartley stood at the edge of the dance floor, her gloved hands clasped tightly before her, betraying none of the anxiety that coiled in her chest like a living thing. 26 years had taught her the art of invisible armor. She had worn her best gown tonight, a modest creation in pale blue that her aunt had insisted brought out the gray of her eyes. Eleanor suspected it merely made her fade further into the pastel sea of debutantes, but she had learned not to voice such observations. Hope, however faint, required maintenance. Mr. Thornton had secured her hand for the first waltz 3 days prior. It was not a coup. He was a younger son with moderate prospects. But it was something. At 26, with neither fortune nor remarkable beauty to recommend her, Eleanor had learned to be grateful for something. The orchestra assembled. Violins whispered their tuning notes into the perfumed air. Miss Hartley. Mr. Thornton appeared at her elbow, his smile practiced and pleasant. I believe this is our... He stopped mid-sentence, his gaze sliding past her shoulder like water over stone. Eleanor knew that look. She had seen it 100 times, that peculiar glaze that descended over a gentleman's eyes when he spotted a worthier object of attention. She did not turn to see what, or whom, had captured him. It would only deepen the wound. Forgive me, he said, already stepping away. I've just remembered. A prior commitment. Surely you understand. He did not wait for her response. Eleanor watched him cross the floor with purpose, navigating through the crowds toward a vision in primrose silk. Miss Lavinia Pemberton, this season's diamond, received his bow with a pretty laugh that carried across the room like birdsong. The first notes of the waltz began. Eleanor stood alone in the clearing that had formed around her, a stone in a river of paired dancers. The music swelled. Couples began to move, swirling into the familiar 3/4 time. She remained motionless, an island of mortification in a sea of graceful motion. She felt their eyes, the sideways glances, the whispered comments hidden behind fans, the smiles that held more pity than kindness. Lady Morrison leaned toward her companion, murmuring something that made both women look Eleanor's way. A young gentleman near the refreshment table shook his head in apparent sympathy, as though she were a wounded animal deserving of merciful regard. 30 seconds. She gave herself 30 seconds to remain standing, chin lifted, expression serene. 30 seconds to prove that Miss Eleanor Hartley possessed dignity, if nothing else. On the 31st second, she turned and walked, not ran, never ran, toward the French doors that opened onto the balcony. Her pace was measured, her carriage erect. Only when the cool evening air touched her face did she allow her composure to fracture. The balcony stretched along the back of the house, shadowed and blessedly empty. Or so she thought. They cannot see you here, Eleanor gasped, spinning toward the voice. A man's silhouette detached itself from the deeper shadows near the stone balustrade, tall and broad-shouldered. She could not make out his features in the darkness, only the pale gleam of his cravat and the glint of light that caught in his hair. Forgive me, she managed, reaching up to dash away the tears she had finally permitted. I did not realize. I shall leave you to your solitude. Stay. The word was quiet but carried an odd weight, as though he'd surprised himself by speaking it. The darkness is large enough for two. Eleanor hesitated. Everything in her upbringing screamed impropriety. Alone with an unknown gentleman, unchaperoned, her reputation already threadbare. But what did it matter now? After tonight's display, her standing in society could sink no lower. She moved to the balustrade, keeping a respectable distance between them. The music drifted through the open doors, mocking her with its beauty. "A handkerchief," the man said, extending a square of white linen. "You'll want it." She took it with trembling fingers, grateful he could not see her face clearly. "Thank you. You are very kind." "No," he said, something raw in his voice. "I am merely well acquainted with the desire to be invisible." Eleanor pressed the handkerchief to her eyes, drawing a shaky breath. "You chose to be out here. I was encouraged to leave." "Ah." A pause. "The waltz." "You saw." "I see everything from the shadows. It is my particular talent." He shifted and she heard the whisper of expensive fabric. "Though I confess, I do not understand why he left you. The loss was entirely his." The kindness in his words nearly undid her again. "You need not—" "I am not being kind," he interrupted. "I am being factual. Any man who abandons his partner for superficial attractions is a fool. Beauty fades. Character endures." Eleanor allowed herself a bitter smile in the darkness. A generous philosophy, one not widely shared by society. "Society?" he said, investing the word with such disdain that she almost laughed, "is populated largely by cowards and sycophants. I stopped attending their rituals 3 years ago. Tonight's attendance is an aberration I already regret. Yet here you are. My cousin threatened to drag me bodily if I refused another invitation. He worries about my isolation." The man turned slightly, and moonlight caught the edge of a strong jaw, a mouth set in grim lines. He does not understand that isolation is preferable to pretense. Eleanor absorbed this, recognizing something familiar in his words. "You speak as one who has been wounded." "And you," he replied softly, "bear scars as well. I can hear them in your voice." They stood in silence, the waltz playing on, behind them. Eleanor felt something shift in her chest. Not romance, not yet, but recognition. This stranger understood loneliness in a way that transcended mere words. "I should return," she said finally, though she made no move to leave. "My absence will be noted. And judged harshly, no doubt." He straightened, and she realized he was quite tall. "For what it is worth, Miss Hartley. Eleanor Hartley. Miss Hartley." He did not offer his own name, and she did not ask. "For what it is worth, you possess more courage than anyone in that ballroom. It takes strength to stand alone." Her throat tightened. Or perhaps it simply takes lack of alternatives. "Perhaps," he conceded. "But you did not weep in public. You did not rage. You maintained grace under circumstances that would have destroyed lesser souls. That is not weakness, Miss Hartley. That is valor." Eleanor felt heat rise to her cheeks, grateful once more for the concealing darkness. "I thank you for the handkerchief and the words." "Keep it," he said. "A reminder that you are not as invisible as you believe." She moved toward the French doors, hesitating on the threshold. When she glanced back, he had melted into the shadows once more, as though he had never been there at all. But his handkerchief remained in her hand, solid and real. Proof that she had not imagined the encounter. The ballroom swallowed her again, all light and laughter and cruel indifference. Eleanor made her way to her Aunt Margaret, who fluttered with concern. "My dear, are you unwell?" "I saw, that is, everyone saw." "I am perfectly well, Aunt." Eleanor managed a smile. Merely needed air. Lady Margaret studied her with worried eyes but pressed no further. They remained for another hour, Eleanor enduring pitying glances and carefully worded condolences. When they finally departed, she had never been more grateful for the privacy of their carriage. At home in her modest bedchamber, Eleanor unfolded the handkerchief and found initials embroidered in one corner. T.A. She pressed it to her cheek, remembering his voice in the darkness. Perhaps valor was simply another word for survival. Miles away, in a Berkeley Square townhouse shrouded in mourning, Thomas Ashford stood at his library window and stared into the night. He could still hear her voice. Quiet, wounded, resilient. Could still see the set of her shoulders as she'd fled the ballroom. Dignity intact despite the cruelty of the crowd. He had not felt anything in 3 years. Not since the accident. Not since Catherine's death had hollowed him into a shell that moved through the world without inhabiting it. But tonight, on that balcony, he had felt something stir. Recognition, kinship, interest. Thomas turned from the window unsettled. He had built his isolation carefully, brick by brick, constructing walls that kept the world at bay. Grief was manageable when one remained numb. Yet Miss Eleanor Hartley, with her gray eyes and quiet valor, had slipped through his defenses like water through cupped hands. He did not know what to do with that. The Carrington residence, though elegant, possessed none of the oppressive grandeur that characterized most Mayfair homes. Its drawing room, where Lady Carrington hosted her monthly literary salon, felt intimate rather than imposing. Precisely why Eleanor appreciated these invitations. Byron's Childe Harold suffers from the poet's own narcissism, Miss Weatherby declared, her voice carrying an unfortunate shrillness. One cannot separate the art from the artist's moral failures. Eleanor shifted in her seat, debating whether to speak. 3 weeks had passed since the disastrous ball. The humiliation had faded into background noise, another entry in the ledger of her social failures. But her love of literature remained undimmed, and Miss Weatherby's assessment rankled. Perhaps, Eleanor ventured quietly, that is precisely Byron's genius. He does not ask us to separate art from artist, but to confront the complexity of both. Childe Harold's pilgrimage is one of disillusionment, yes, but also of seeking. Even morally compromised souls hunger for meaning. The room fell silent. Several ladies turned to regard her with surprise. Eleanor Hartley, the spinster companion, rarely spoke during these gatherings. An interesting perspective, Miss Hartley. Mr. James Hartley, her cousin, smiled encouragingly from across the room. Though I wonder if you give Byron too much credit for self-awareness. Or perhaps not enough, another voice interjected, deep and familiar in a way that made Eleanor's pulse quicken. Byron understood his own darkness better than most men understand their virtues. That is why his work endures. It is mercilessly honest. Eleanor turned to find the speaker, and her breath caught. The man from the balcony stood near the doorway, dressed impeccably in charcoal gray. In the lamplight, she finally saw his face clearly. Strong features carved with grief. Dark hair touched with silver at the temples. Eyes the color of winter storms. He was looking directly at her. "Lord Blackwood," Lady Carrington fluttered, clearly pleased. "How wonderful that you could join us. We so rarely have the pleasure of your company." Blackwood. Eleanor's stomach dropped. The Earl of Blackwood, one of the wealthiest, most influential men in England. Reclusive since his wife's death 3 years prior, the man who had offered her his handkerchief in the darkness. He navigated the room with quiet authority, nodding to acquaintances, until he stood near Eleanor's chair. Miss Hartley makes an excellent point. Byron's value lies not in his virtue, but in his unflinching examination of vice. Discomfort is often the price of truth. Eleanor could not speak. She had unburdened herself to an earl, wept in front of him, accepted his comfort like a common. "You know each other?" James asked, glancing between them with barely concealed curiosity. "We met briefly," Lord Blackwood said smoothly, "though I confess I did not properly introduce myself. An oversight I hope to correct." The conversation resumed, but Eleanor barely heard it. Lord Blackwood maneuvered with subtle skill until he occupied the chair beside hers, close enough that she caught the scent of sandalwood and something darker. Leather, perhaps, or tobacco. "You did not tell me who you were," she whispered when the others were distracted by Lady Carrington's anecdote about meeting Wordsworth. "You did not ask." His mouth curved slightly. "Would it have changed what you said?" "Yes," she admitted. "I would have said nothing at all." "Precisely why I remained anonymous." He tilted his head, studying her with unsettling intensity. "You interest me, Miss Hartley. You possess a rare quality. Authenticity. You do not perform for your audience." "I lack the beauty or status to make performance worthwhile, my lord." "Thomas," he corrected quietly. "And you misunderstand. I said you interest me, not that you lack appeal. There is a difference." Heat flooded her cheeks. Eleanor glanced away, certain he was being kind again, offering comfort to the pitiful spinster. Lords did not develop interest in women like her. Not genuine interest, at any rate. The salon concluded an hour later. As guests collected wraps and made farewells, James approached with Lord Blackwood in tow. "Cousin, Lord Blackwood has expressed interest in walking with us in Hyde Park tomorrow afternoon. I assured him we would be delighted by his company." Eleanor's protest died unspoken. One did not refuse an earl, especially not when said earl was watching her with those storm-gray eyes that seemed to see through her careful defenses. "Of course," she managed. "We would be honored." "Until tomorrow, then." Lord Blackwood bowed, the gesture formal, yet somehow intimate. "I look forward to continuing our discussion about Byron's moral ambiguities." As their carriage rattled homeward, James regarded her with barely suppressed amusement. "Well, that was unexpected." "He is being courteous," Eleanor said firmly. "Nothing more." "Blackwood has refused every invitation, every introduction, every social overture for 3 years. He emerged from isolation tonight and made direct conversation with exactly one person." James raised an eyebrow. "You, cousin. That is not mere courtesy." Eleanor stared out the window, watching London blur past. She wanted to believe James, wanted to indulge the dangerous flutter in her chest. But hope was a luxury she could no longer afford. Men of Lord Blackwood's standing did not court women of her position. If he sought anything, it was likely uncomplicated companionship. Someone grateful enough, desperate enough, not to demand genuine affection. The thought hollowed her. Hyde Park glittered in afternoon sunlight, the serpentine reflecting clouds like a silver mirror. Eleanor walked beside Aunt Margaret, parasol shading her face, while Lord Blackwood rode alongside on a magnificent bay gelding. He had appeared precisely on time, dressed for riding, and requested permission to accompany them on foot after securing his horse. Aunt Margaret, overwhelmed by his lordship's condescension, had agreed effusively. Now she walked several paces behind, offering them privacy that felt both thrilling and terrifying. "You are quiet today," Lord Blackwood observed. "Have I done something to offend?" "No." Eleanor kept her eyes forward. "I am merely wondering why you are here." "Direct. I appreciate that." He was silent for several strides. "I told you on the balcony that I recognized something in you. That remains true. I find your company restful." "Restful," she repeated, tasting the word's inadequacy. "Perhaps that sounds insulting." "I do not mean it to be." He paused, choosing words carefully. "For 3 years, I have endured well-meaning attempts at consolation, at distraction, at reintroducing me to society's pleasures. Everyone wants something from me, my title, my wealth, my influence. Or they handle me like fragile porcelain, terrified I might shatter. And I do not do that." You spoke to me as though I were simply a man. Not an earl, not a widower, not a tragic figure. Just someone standing in the darkness. His voice roughened. Do you understand how rare that is? Eleanor did understand. She understood the exhaustion of being defined by one's losses, by what one lacked rather than what one possessed. But understanding and trusting were different territories entirely. I am flattered, my lord. Thomas. Thomas. She forced herself to meet his gaze. But I cannot help wondering if you seek my company because it demands nothing of you. I am safe. Unimportant. A person with whom you can practice re-entering the world without risk. He stopped walking. Is that what you believe? I believe, Eleanor said carefully, that men of your position do not court women of mine unless motivated by convenience or pity. Thunder gathered in his expression. You think I pity you? I think you recognized a fellow sufferer and offered kindness. I am grateful for it. But I will not mistake kindness for regard, nor convenience for genuine feeling. You are wrong. He stepped closer, close enough that she could see gold flecks in his gray eyes. I sought you out because you made me feel something other than numbness for the first time in 3 years. Because your intelligence and resilience drew me like light draws those long trapped in darkness. Not pity, Miss Hartley. Recognition. Eleanor's breath caught. She wanted desperately to believe him, but years of disappointment had taught caution. I do not know what you want me to say. Say you will allow me to call on you. Properly. His intensity softened into something almost vulnerable. Say you will give me the opportunity to prove my sincerity. Behind them, Aunt Margaret coughed delicately, a reminder of propriety and presence. Eleanor should refuse, should protect herself from inevitable heartbreak. But standing in dappled sunlight, seeing raw hope in Lord Blackwood's face, she found her defenses crumbling. You may call, she whispered, if you wish. His smile transformed him, erasing years of grief in a single expression. I do wish. Very much. Thomas called 3 times in the following fortnight. Each visit stretched longer than propriety strictly allowed, though Lady Margaret proved an accommodating chaperone, often finding reasons to briefly absent herself. They discussed philosophy and poetry, art and politics. Eleanor discovered that Thomas possessed a keen mind and wry humor beneath his grief. He, in turn, seemed to drink in her observations, her quiet insights into human nature. On his 4th visit, he brought a first edition of Wordsworth's lyrical ballads. For you, he said simply. I noticed you quoted from it at the salon. Eleanor stared at the volume, knowing its value. I cannot accept. You can, and you will. It is a gift between friends. He pressed it into her hands. Please, Eleanor, allow me the pleasure of giving you something you will actually appreciate. She clutched the book to her chest, overwhelmed. No one had ever given her anything so thoughtful, so perfectly suited to her interests. Thank you, she managed, truly. But the following week, at Lady Pemberton's afternoon tea, Eleanor's fragile happiness shattered. She stood near the refreshment table when Miss Lavinia Pemberton glided past with her coterie, voices pitched to carry. Poor Lord Blackwood, Lavinia sighed, seeking consolation in such unexpected quarters. One cannot blame him, Miss Fletcher replied. Widowers need companionship. And Miss Hartley is so very grateful. Convenient, really. Precisely. No demands, no expectations of grand romance. Simply someone to ease his loneliness without complication. Lavinia smiled sweetly at Eleanor. How fortunate for both of you. The words burrowed into Eleanor's chest like thorns. She set down her teacup with trembling hands and made her excuses, leaving before the tears could fall. That night, she stared at Wordsworth's book and wondered if Lavinia was right. If Thomas sought not a partner, but a balm for his wounds, someone who would demand nothing because she had no standing to demand anything at all. When he called 2 days later, Eleanor kept her distance, answering in careful monosyllables. Thomas noticed immediately. "What has changed?" he asked when Lady Margaret departed for her inevitable errand. "Nothing has changed. Perhaps that is the problem?" Eleanor twisted her hands in her lap. "Perhaps nothing was ever what I believed it to be." "Explain." His voice carried an edge she had not heard before. "Why are you truly here, Thomas? And please do not insult me with talk of recognition and light. I have been pitied before. I recognize its face." He surged to his feet, frustration radiating from him. "This again. After everything, she interrupted, rising to face him. "I remain who I am. A woman without fortune or beauty or prospects. While you are an earl who grieves his dead wife and seeks, what? Distraction? Convenience? Someone grateful enough not to expect love?" "Love?" He stared at her as though she'd spoken in tongues. "You think I'm incapable of love?" "I think you loved your wife. I think you carry that loss like a wound that will never heal. And I think—" Her voice broke. "I think I am simply someone who makes that wound more bearable because I expect nothing." Thomas crossed to her in 3 strides, grasping her shoulders. "You want to know why I come here? Why I sought you out? I will tell you." He released her, pacing like a caged animal. "My wife died 3 years ago. Catherine. We were traveling to our country estate, and I insisted we leave despite the weather. The roads were terrible. The carriage overturned." His voice turned ragged. "She was pregnant. I killed them both with my impatience." Eleanor's hands flew to her mouth. "For 3 years I have existed in purgatory. I convinced myself I did not deserve happiness, did not deserve to feel anything but guilt. And then—" He turned to her, eyes blazing. "Then I saw you on that balcony, carrying your own pain with such courage, and something in me cracked open. You were not a convenience, Eleanor. You were a revelation. Thomas, when I speak with you, the guilt recedes. Not because you're undemanding, but because you remind me that life continues despite loss. That feeling is not betrayal." He stepped closer. "You make me want to live again. Not survive. Live. That is not pity. That is not convenience. That is—" He stopped, as though the word he sought was too large, too dangerous. Eleanor stood frozen, her entire worldview tilting. "I do not know what to say." "Say you believe me. Say you will trust that what I feel is real." His hand lifted, hovering near her cheek without touching. "Say you will give me time to prove it." She saw truth in his face, naked and vulnerable. Saw the man beneath the title, the human beneath the armor of grief. "The season ends in 10 days, she whispered. "There is a final ball at the Duke of Hartwell's residence. I know it well. I was last there 3 weeks ago, hiding on a balcony." His mouth quirked. "Why do you mention it?" "Because I am terrified," she admitted. "Terrified that I will believe you, and this will all prove to be illusion. Terrified that even if your feelings are genuine, society will destroy us with their doubt and derision." Thomas cupped her face gently, the first time he had truly touched her. "Then let me remove your terror. Come to the ball. Trust me for one more night. I swear to you, Eleanor, I will prove my sincerity beyond any doubt." She wanted to ask how, wanted to demand guarantees, but something in his eyes made her believe. "One more night," she breathed. "One more night," he agreed. "And then forever, if you will have me." Eleanor stood before her looking glass, barely recognizing the woman reflected there. Aunt Margaret had insisted on a new gown for the final ball. Pale silver silk that caught the lamplight like moonwater. Her dark hair had been dressed with pearl pins, and her gray eyes seemed larger, more luminous. Or perhaps that was simply fear. "You look beautiful, my dear," Aunt Margaret said softly, adjusting Eleanor's gloves. "Though I suspect you could wear sackcloth tonight and still shine." "I feel ill." "That is called hope, Eleanor. It always feels like illness at first." Her aunt smiled. "Lord Blackwood is a good man. Trust him." A knock sounded. A footman appeared with a bouquet of white roses and a card. Eleanor's hands shook as she read the note. "Trust me." T. The carriage ride to Mayfair passed in a blur. As they approached the Duke's residence, the same house where her humiliation had occurred, Eleanor's courage nearly failed. "I cannot go in there," she whispered. "Not again." "You can," Aunt Margaret said firmly, "because you are not the same woman who fled 3 weeks ago, and because someone is waiting for you." The ballroom blazed with light and laughter, exactly as she remembered. Eleanor stepped inside on trembling legs, acutely aware of the glances, the whispers. Lady Morrison leaned toward her companion. Miss Fletcher smirked behind her fan. Then Eleanor saw him. Thomas stood near the orchestra, dressed in midnight blue that made him look like a prince from fairy tales. When their eyes met across the crowded room, everything else faded to insignificance. He moved toward her with purpose, the crowd parting before him. Murmurs rippled in his wake. The reclusive Earl of Blackwood returned to society, walking directly toward the spinster Hartley. "Miss Hartley." He bowed, formal and perfect. "Would you honor me with the first waltz?" The first waltz? The same dance that had destroyed her 3 weeks prior. Eleanor glanced around, seeing calculation in every face. Miss Lavinia Pemberton watched with narrowed eyes. Mr. Thornton had the grace to look ashamed. She could not seem to find words. Thomas extended his hand, his expression open and certain. "Trust me," he said quietly, echoing his note. She placed her gloved hand in his. The orchestra began, and Eleanor's heart lurched. The same waltz, the same music that had accompanied her humiliation. But this time, Thomas's hand settled at her waist, warm and steady. This time, his other hand held hers with perfect confidence. They began to move. Eleanor had learned to waltz years ago, though she'd had few opportunities to practice. But Thomas guided her effortlessly, making her feel graceful, making her feel seen. The ballroom spun around them, a kaleidoscope of envious faces and glittering light. "You are trembling," he murmured. "I am terrified." "Don't be." He smiled, something wild and determined in his eyes. "Watch." And then, in the middle of the dance, the floor, surrounded by 200 members of the ton, Thomas stopped moving. The music played on, but they stood motionless. Slowly, the other dancers faltered, the room falling into confused silence. Even the orchestra trailed off, uncertain. Everyone stared. Thomas kept hold of Eleanor's hand, turning to face the assembled crowd. His voice, when he spoke, carried to every corner of the room. "Forgive the interruption, but I find I cannot wait another moment to say something that should have been said weeks ago." He looked at Eleanor, and she saw her entire future in his eyes. 3 years ago, I lost my wife, and I believed I had forfeited the right to happiness. I built walls around my grief, convinced that feeling anything would betray her memory. The room held its breath. Then I met Miss Eleanor Hartley, and she showed me that I was wrong. She did not do this through beauty or artifice or social advantage. She has none of these things by society's narrow measure. His hand tightened on hers. She did it through courage, intelligence, kindness, and a resilience that humbles me. She did it by being authentically, genuinely herself in a world that demands performance. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Aunt Margaret pressed a handkerchief to her mouth, tears streaming. "Some of you," Thomas continued, his gaze sweeping the room with aristocratic disdain, "have suggested that my interest in Miss Hartley stems from convenience. That I seek an undemanding companion who will expect nothing and provide solace without complication." His voice hardened. "You are wrong. I seek not convenience but partnership. Not comfort but challenge. Not a balm for grief but a reason to embrace life again." He turned back to Eleanor, dropping to one knee on the polished parquet floor. Someone gasped. Lady Pemberton, perhaps? Or Miss Fletcher? Eleanor could not tell. Her vision had tunneled to Thomas's face, to the ring that suddenly glinted in his palm. "Eleanor Hartley," he said clearly, "you are the most extraordinary woman I have ever known. You have given me back hope, given me back joy, given me back the courage to believe I deserve both. I am not offering you convenience. I am offering you my heart, my life, my devotion. For as long as you will have them." His voice roughened. "Will you marry me?" The silence stretched impossibly long. Eleanor was aware of hundreds of eyes watching, of Lavinia Pemberton's pale face, of Mr. Thornton's slack-jawed surprise. She was aware of her aunt's joyful tears and the Duke of Hartwell's approving nod. But mostly she was aware of Thomas, kneeling before her in front of everyone who had dismissed her, claiming her publicly, irrevocably, as his choice. "Yes," she whispered. Then, louder for everyone to hear, "Yes, yes, I will marry you." Thomas surged to his feet, sliding the ring, a sapphire surrounded by diamonds, onto her finger. Then, before God and society and everyone who had ever called her invisible, he cupped her face and kissed her. The ballroom erupted. Applause thundered from some quarters, shocked silence from others. Eleanor heard Aunt Margaret sobbing happily, heard the Duke call for champagne, heard the orchestra strike up a triumphant chord. But all of it felt distant, muffled, because Thomas was kissing her like she was precious, like she was chosen, like she was loved. When he pulled back, his eyes were bright. Was that proof enough? Eleanor laughed, giddy and overwhelmed. "It will suffice." He tucked her hand into his elbow, turning to face the crowd once more. People surged forward, some with congratulations, others with barely concealed chagrin. Eleanor saw Lavinia slip away toward the retiring room, her coterie following like chastened ducklings. Mr. Thornton approached, shame-faced. "Miss Hartley, I must apologize." "No apologies necessary," Eleanor interrupted, surprising herself with her firmness. "You did me a favor, Mr. Thornton. If you had not abandoned me, I would never have fled to the balcony, and I would never have met the man I am going to marry." Thomas smiled down at her, fierce pride in his expression. The evening continued in a whirl of congratulations and champagne, but eventually, Thomas guided Eleanor toward the French doors, the same ones she had fled through weeks ago. "I thought you might appreciate some air," he murmured. "Though I promise, this time you need not hide in the shadows." They stepped onto the balcony, now softly lit by lanterns. The music drifted behind them, gentle and romantic. "I still cannot quite believe it," Eleanor admitted. "This morning I was a spinster of no consequence. Tonight I am betrothed to an earl." "Tonight," Thomas corrected, "you are betrothed to a man who loves you. The earl is merely incidental." He drew her close, one hand settling at her waist, the other capturing hers. "Dance with me, properly this time. No interruptions, no declarations. Just us." They swayed to the distant waltz, alone under the stars. "Do you believe me now?" Thomas asked after a moment. "Do you believe this is real?" Eleanor looked up at him, seeing the man who had offered her his handkerchief in darkness, who had sought her company when he could have chosen anyone, who had declared his love before all of society. Yes, she said. I believe you. Good. He smiled, pressing a kiss to her forehead. Because I meant every word. You will never stand alone in a ballroom again, Eleanor. Never be invisible. Never be dismissed. And you? She touched his face gently. You will never hide in the shadows again. Never believe you do not deserve happiness. We heal each other, he murmured. Is that not what love should be? Eleanor rose on her toes and kissed him, pouring 3 weeks of doubt and fear and desperate hope into the gesture. When they parted, she was breathless. When shall we marry? Thomas asked. I confess, I am eager to make you my countess. Soon, Eleanor said, but not too soon. I want to savor this, the knowing that I am chosen, the certainty that I am loved. Then savor it, he agreed, though know that I will be impossibly impatient. They stood together on the balcony, wrapped in each other's arms, while London glittered below them and music played behind them. Eleanor thought of the woman she had been 3 weeks ago, heartbroken, humiliated, convinced she would live and die alone. That woman would not recognize her now. Thank you, she whispered. Thomas pulled back to look at her, questioning. For seeing me, Eleanor clarified. For seeing me when everyone else looked through me. For making me believe I was worth seeing. My darling Eleanor, he said softly, brushing a strand of hair from her face. You were always worth seeing. The world was simply blind. She leaned into his touch, marveling at how natural it felt, how right. I used to think invisibility was my curse. Now I wonder if it was not a gift. It kept me hidden until you were ready to find me. Perhaps we were both in shadows, Thomas mused, both waiting for someone brave enough to reach across the darkness. The French doors opened behind them, and Aunt Margaret appeared, tactfully clearing her throat. Forgive the intrusion, but the Duke wishes to make a toast. He says it is not every day his ballroom hosts such a romantic spectacle. Thomas laughed, the sound warm and genuine. Tell His Grace we shall be honored. But before they returned to the glittering assembly, Eleanor paused, looking back at the balcony railing where she had stood 3 weeks prior, broken and alone. What is it? Thomas asked. I am remembering, she said quietly. Remembering the woman who stood here believing she would never be anything but invisible. Believing she would never be loved. And now? Eleanor turned to him, seeing her future reflected in his storm-gray eyes. A future filled with partnership, respect, and genuine affection. A future where she was not merely tolerated, but treasured. Now I know better, she said, smiling through happy tears. Now I know that the right person does not make you feel invisible. They make you feel luminous. Thomas kissed her hand, his lips lingering over the sapphire ring that marked her as his. Luminous, he repeated. Yes, that is precisely what you are. They returned to the ballroom together, hand in hand, to face the society that had once dismissed them both. But everything had changed. Thomas was no longer the grief-stricken recluse, and Eleanor was no longer the overlooked spinster. They were simply two people who had found each other in darkness and chosen to walk into the light together. As the Duke of Hartwell raised his glass in toast, as champagne flowed and the orchestra played, as even the most skeptical members of the Ton offered congratulations, Eleanor felt something unfamiliar bloom in her chest. Hope. Not the fragile, desperate hope she had clung to before, but something stronger, something certain. The hope of a woman who was loved, who was chosen, who was finally, irrevocably seen. And when Thomas pulled her back onto the dance floor for another waltz, their waltz, the one they would remember for the rest of their lives, Eleanor Hartley danced without fear, without doubt, without anything but pure joy. She had been left partnerless once, abandoned in humiliation, but she would never stand alone again.